Bonjour, Taji, and I would like to welcome each and every one of you to my new series, Metis Trailblazers. Of course, it's an offshoot of Metis Time Capsule. I want to thank each and every one of you who have supported me through this journey to really celebrate and share the Metis people who have really set the stage, set the firm foundation for a very powerful and proud Metis Nation. And really, thank you also to the individuals that have been sending me suggestions of powerful Métis people to include in the Métis Trailblazer series. And you know what, folks? You can bet your bannock I'm going to include each and every one of them. And if you haven't guessed it already, you're, of course, with your host, Alexandria Anthony. Bound by the sash, the fiddle, the Red River cart, and the river, the Métis people have truly endured hardship, injustice, and exile, yet stood proud and tall in the face of it all, folks. And like I've said previously, each Métis Trailblazers series is going to include 5 individuals at a time. And I truly invite you to dig deeper, research, explore these powerful Métis people and how they really fit into, again, setting the stage for a very proud and powerful Métis Nation. I'm not going to include everything about their lives. They're just too much to condense into one show. And this segment, of course, is part 2 of Metis Trailblazers. And today we're going to include James Isbister, Elzear Goulet, Ambroise Lepine, John Norquay, and Marie Rose Delorme Smith. So, folks, without further ado, let's get into our first trailblazer, and that is James Isbister. And James Isbister was born in 1833 at Oxford House, Manitoba, and was the 3rd child of John Isbister, a Scot who worked for the Hudson Bay Company, and Francis Sinclair, a Métis. And I'm going to stop right there, folks. You may or may not have noticed that through these Métis Trailblazers, just like the Red River flows, the Northwest Company, the Hudson Bay Company, there are strong links, strong ties to the Métis people, the fur trade. We really were important people in the Canadian fur trade. It is also believed that Isbister obtained his education at the Red River settlement, and he followed his father's footsteps into service of the Hudson Bay Company, engaging as a laborer in August 1853. And he spent his entire career in Cumberland and Saskatchewan districts, mostly in the region around Cumberland House, Saskatchewan, and the forks of the North and South Saskatchewan rivers. And he did retire permanently from the Hudson Bay Company in 1871. It has also been said, and this is very important when it comes to play with Isbister being a Hudson Bay Company interpreter. It has been said that he was fluent in several languages, including Gaelic, Cree, and Michif. And you know what, folks? In my personal opinion, since his father was an Orkney man with the Hudson Bay Company, I would gamble, and I think it would be a good guess that he would have known Bungi, the Red River dialect as well. And in 1862, Isbister and his wife, Margaret Bear, founded the Isbister Métis settlement and leading the community and establishing several farmsteads in the region over the ensuing decades. and the Isbister Métis settlement would eventually become the city of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. In the late 1870s and early 1880s, the federal government began land surveys that really encroached on Métis land, and Isbister became a leader in the movement to gain redress for Métis grievances. And he also was one of 4 Métis delegates who traveled to Montana to ask Louis Riel to return from exile in the United States in order to lead the Métis protest movement in Canada. Isbister also supported the Métis cause, but he did not participate in the 1885 rebellion. And however, he did make his feelings known in a very poignant letter to a newspaper editor. And let's get into that now. And I quote, "Mr. Editor, if Canada wants this country to be a free home for millions, as she freely advertised in the old country, let her not begin by tyrannizing over the native population and depriving the inhabitants of the Northwest Territories of their sacred rights as British subjects." End of quote, of course, by James Isbister. He also took a leading role in the Settlers Union, which was established at Prince Albert on October 16th, 1883, to really press for redress for grievances concerning land. And the union represented the white majority as well as both Métis communities, and was initially endorsed by the Prince Albert Times and the Saskatchewan Review, which was the voice of the white population. When the government's insensitivity finally led to violence in March 1885, Isbister and most of the English, Scottish, Métis, as we call country-born, did not follow the new path taken by Louis Riel. Nonetheless, Isbister was imprisoned for 5 weeks at Prince Albert until the resistance was crushed. And upon his release late in May, he really publicly defended his previous actions and criticized the recent widespread violation of civil rights. And for a time in the 1880s, he had been one of the most important leaders of the English Métis, as we call country-born, and a driving force in uniting them and the French Métis. Perhaps in the process of sowing with other Métis leaders the seeds of the single Métis nation of today. Very, very important, trying to unify French Métis with country-born Métis. So that's the qualities of a leader. So James Isbister was an interpreter for Hudson Bay Company, and Isbister also may have been the first man in what is now known as Saskatchewan to grow wheat on his farm. He also worked on the John Smith Reserve, which is now currently Muscoda First Nation, as a farm instructor. As a community leader, he also was selected as one of the 4 delegates, along with Gabriel Dumont, sent to recall Riel from Montana to lead his people. After the Northwest resistance, Isbister was active in the Anglican Church of Canada in Prince Albert area. And the Isbister Métis settlement would eventually become the city of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and he is well known to be considered the founder of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. James Isbister, rightly so, folks, well-earned honor, was designated as a National Historic Person in 1997. Of course, he was a fur trader, postmaster, clerk, laborer for the Hudson Bay Company, and sadly, James Isbister died October 16th, 1915 in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. So a very powerful individual, a powerful Métis leader, powerful Métis trailblazer to really, again, set the stage, firm foundations of a strong Métis nation as we know today. Let's get right into our second Métis Trailblazer in part 2 of our series, and it is Elzear Goulet. And he really was a martyr of the Métis, and he was murdered by Canadian soldiers, stoned to death in the waters of the Red River. Elzear was born November 18th, 1836, St. Boniface, Red River Settlement, now known as Winnipeg, Manitoba. He was the third son of Alexis Goulet and Josephine Silverite. And Alexis was the descendant of a long line of voyageurs. And the well-documented history of the Goulet family in the fur trade in Canada can be traced back to voyageurs who paddled Quebec waters westward from early in the 18th century. One of Elzear Goulet's ancestors came west from New France with the explorer Pierre Gauthier du Vannes et de la Vérendrye in search of the Western Sea in 1730. For those who do not know, La Vérendrye and his men were the first Europeans to set eyes on much of the landscape, flora, and fauna and peoples of Western Canada. Elzear's grandfather, Jacques Goulet, was posted in Athabasca, where he worked for the Northwest Company as a voyageur from 1804 to 1821, and Jacques Goulet retired from the Hudson Bay service in 1824. The legacy of the Goulet family, who worked for the Northwest Company and Hudson Bay Company as voyageurs, was passed from father to son as Jacques Goulet's son, Alexis Goulet, became a bayman too. And Alexis Goulet, Elzear's father, died December 25th, 1856. It is interesting to note that when Alexis's contract with the Hudson Bay Company expired, he became a free man in Red River Settlement until 1835. Little is known of Elzear's mother. Her name was Josephine Silverite, and she was born 1816 and died in 1891. Elzear's grandfather, John Silverite, was born December 1779 in Scotland, and he began working with the Northwest Company in 1799. Interesting to note, folks, that John Silverite was charged as an accessory in the murder of Governor Robert Semple and 20 Scottish settlers, of course, at the victory of Frog Plain. He went to trial in York, which is now Toronto, along with Allan MacDonald, Cuthbert Grant Jr., and other Métis in October 1818. The charges, of course, were dropped, and John Silverite, Elzear's maternal grandfather, is buried at Edinburgh, Scotland. Not much is known and documented of Elzear's childhood or as a young man. His father, Alexis, was a buffalo hunter, bison hunter, so it could safely be assumed he accompanied him on the hunt. When Elzear was around 25 years old, he took over the mail route from Pembina to Upper Fort Garry from his eldest brother Roger. And Elzear met Joseph Goulet, who was postmaster at Pembina, and Goulet was very influential in the Pembina area. It was thought that this friendship that Elzear uh, had, he met Goulet's niece, Helene Jerome. They were married on March 8th, 1859, in Assumption Church in Pembina, North Dakota. And it was at this time that Elzear would become an American citizen. So we know also Louis Riel became an American citizen. Elzear really got his determination for Métis rights from his father, Alexis. And Alexis helped to assemble 25 buffalo hunters along with freighters and traders. And on August 29th, 1845, they wrote a letter demanding the rights of the Métis. And the men helped James Sinclair, a Hudson Bay Company trader and explorer, to write a letter to Governor Alexander Christie of Red River. And the aim of the letter was to demand that the Métis deserve the rights to hunt furs in the Hudson Bay Company territories, while also having the right to sell those furs to the highest bidder without being prosecuted, apprehended. The Goulet family name status was really given status and notoriety from Elzear's older brother, Roger. Roger held the position of surveyor, district judge, and member of the Council of Assiniboia, and also had connections to the church and government. The Ottawa government gave the title of the Honorable Roger Goulet, which allowed him to negotiate with Riel and Métis leaders about land claims being disputed at this particular time in history. And it was because of the social standing of Roger that this really persuaded Riel to promote Elzear to military rank of captain in Riel's provisional government, where he served under Ambroise Lepine. It is also interesting to note that Roger was the godson and protege of Monsignor Provence. In the late fall of 1869, Elzear joined an organized group of Métis led by Louis Riel. The group had constructed a barricade at the bridge on the La Salle River, which was the main north-south route from Upper Fort Garry to Pembina. And this was really to prevent the Canadian government officials from claiming land already occupied by Métis. And this barricade was called La Barrière. And it is now a vast 84-hectare park on outskirts of southwest Winnipeg in Manitoba. On March 3rd, 1870, Elzear served as a member of the court-martial for Thomas Scott, who was accused of treason against the provisional government in Red River. Thomas Scott was an Irish Orangeman who had recently immigrated to Red River from Upper Canada and really protested quite violently against Métis land rights. And Scott not only was in support of the Canadian government's claim of Métis lands, he wanted them to be redistributed to Ontario immigrants, but he really voiced a racist and anti-Catholic settlement. And on the day following the trial, Elzear, with other members of the court, escorted Scott outside the walls of Upper Fort Garry and executed him by firing squad. Prior to being executed, it has been said Scott continually insulted the guards, and threatened to shoot Louis Riel if he was ever freed. After Scott's execution, Protestants in Canada's largest province, Ontario, reacted with anger. After Scott's execution, Elzear and Elzear Goulet, who was Elzear's brother-in-law, were given the duty of disposing of Thomas Scott's corpse. To this day, no one really knows where the corpse was placed, but it was rumored that they dressed Scott's body in Métis clothing, placed it on a sled, and drove the sled onto the ice and into the Red River. By dressing Scott as a Métis, they intended that he would be unrecognizable if his body was found later in the spring. The disguising and disposing of Scott's body in the Red River, this really was a way to deny Scott a proper Christian burial, to further add insult to injury to a man clearly hated by Riel and his supporters. In August 1870, the Garnet Joseph Wolseley military expedition arrived at Upper Fort Garry, and the Wolseley expedition was sent by Ottawa to take control and maintain peace in Red River until Lieutenant Governor Archibald arrived. Wolseley and his militiamen were to act as a police force and secure the West from any further uprising. Louis Riel and many members of his provisional government left the area for fear of a violent retaliation for Thomas Scott's death. Elzear chose to stay at Red River, a choice that would soon prove to be fatal. A few weeks after the arrival of the Wolseley expedition in September, Elzear entered the Red Saloon, located at the corner of Portage Avenue and Main Street in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The Red Saloon was a wild and rowdy drinking establishment run by American brothers from New York City, Bob and Hugh F. Olone. Did you know Hugh Olone served in the Union Army during the American Civil War? He rose to the rank of captain before being discharged in 1865. He began trading whiskey on the American frontier until a dispute in mid-1866 brought him to Upper Fort Garry. He and his brother, of course, opened the Red Saloon. Hugh was also a member of Riel's provisional government, which made the Red Saloon a safe watering hole until Wolseley soldiers arrived at the Red River. Wolseley soldiers were stationed at Upper Fort Garry, only a few hundred meters away from the Red Saloon, and the Red Saloon soon became the tavern of choice for the soldiers and other Orangemen supporters. For those who may not know, the term Orangeman is a member of a secret society organized in the north of Ireland in 1795 to defend the British sovereign and to support the Protestant religion. Sadly, Hugh Olone was severely injured in a barroom brawl at Pembina, at Dakota Territory, which of course is now North Dakota, and he died from a head wound. This is now how the story is going to turn to show sheer brutality of the colonial government. It is not known why Elzear Goulet entered the Red Saloon on September 13th, 1870. He boldly walked into the saloon in the middle of the afternoon, believing that it was a safe time to avoid any conflicts with the patrons that were currently at the Red Saloon. But he realized far too late that he had walked into a hornet's nest of a deadly brood of drunken men. He was recognized for his role in the resistance by John Farquharson, who had been a prisoner of the provisional government. Elzear was chased down Post Office Street, now Lombard Avenue, by Farquharson and a band of vigilantes led by officers of the Ontario Rifles. At the end of the street, a desperate Elzear dove into the Red River from the steamboat landing in an attempt to swim across the river to safety in St. Boniface. The angry colonial mob was completely out of control. He was pelted left and right with stones, literally being killed, being stoned to death. It is sad that he was knocked on the head unconscious in the muddy currents of the Red River and drowned. So murdered by an angry mob, a colonial mob. Many soldiers in the Ontario Rifles and Canadian Volunteers joined the Wolseley military expedition to take revenge for the execution of Scott. And a Judge Francis Granshaw Johnson reports to Lieutenant Governor Archibald that it might be possible to make out a murder charge against Farquharson for inciting the others. And I quote, "The person against whom such a charge could possibly be made are Farquharson, who, according to one witness only, called out to the people in the house to kill him, and Saunders, Madigan, and Campbell, who pursued and who, if they shared that intent, are all equally guilty." Although Lord Kimberley of the British Colonial Office wrote in January 27th, 1871, and I quote, "There is violence enough to send the case to trial," end of quote. Judge Johnson had already recommended in December that no one be charged for the murder of Elzear Goulet. What? This is such a sick and a twisted example of a corrupt and unjust colonial government oppression against Métis, the reign of terror against the Métis and the Red River. They literally, folks, they got away with murder. And this really sends a strong and brutal message to the Métis at this time that they are no longer welcome here. You show your face on the west side of the Red River, we will beat you. We will kill you. If you think you will get help from the Canadian authorities now that we are established here, you can forget it. As a result, many Métis who had lived in the area for several generations moved from Manitoba to Saskatchewan, Montana, and to other areas. During this period, Elzear was not alone in being singled out and attacked, brutally attacked by vigilantes. Other Métis who served on Riel's provisional government, some were badly beaten, and others were murdered by unidentified assailants. It was commonly believed in Red River that these were acts of revenge for the death of Thomas Scott, and since no official action was taken to bring these crimes to justice, the law seemed to really favor those who were committing these heinous crimes. So the government was really, it would seem, it would appear, was supporting this vigilante action. The Elzear Goulet story really represents the political and civil tension which existed at the time the province of Manitoba and the city of Winnipeg were being created. Elzear's story is a tragic story of the fight to preserve a culture and a way of life and to find a place of one's own. We're talking about Métis people. Goulet's final resting place is in the cemetery at the St. Boniface Cathedral, is marked with a simple white monument. All it says is Elzear Goulet died at St. Boniface the 13th of September, 1870, at the age of 34 years old. There is not a thing that would tell you the story of his tragic role in this Winnipeg Canadian history. This is alleged, folks. Allegedly, Elzear's daughter, Lorette, she was 17 years old at this time, was brutally raped by Red River Expedition soldiers. Those participating in the rapes were identified to Colonel Jarvis, who replied that it was none of his business. So here you have allegedly Elzear's daughter, aged 17 years old, was brutally raped by Red River Expedition soldiers. And you have Colonel Jarvis saying, he just replied, it was none of his business. Hello, excuse me? So, Manitoba police, they took statements. Of course, let me guess, there was no charges laid. What I find interesting is Elzear and Helene's son Roger was born in 1867, and in the 1901 Canadian census, Roger was recorded as living at 97 Mason Street with his family. The curious part is in the column of the census that is labeled race, he states he is Scottish. The mystery is why Scottish and not French. It is plausible he did not want to be identified or linked to his Métis ancestry to protect his interest and social status in the community early in his career. The telling of Elzear's story symbolizes a greater issue than a single event in time. It represents a dark period in the early beginnings of Manitoba that needs to be acknowledged. It is a human rights issue where all people should be treated equally and fairly. Elzear wanted a good life for his family and to bring stability and fairness to Manitoba. He stood up for what he believed in. He was right and just. He did what he did for his children, like we all would do for our children, so they could live in a harmonious state. This is the message of his tragic story. In 2007, Winnipeg City Councillor Dan Vandel led a drive for Winnipeg to establish an Elzear Goulet Memorial park near the spot where Goulet was brutally murdered. And the park was officially opened September 13th, 2008. And the Manitoba Métis Federation also has a local called El Conseil Elzear Goulet. And I think that's very fascinating and important for his legacy. And it is sad but true that colonialism and racism has really been a part of Manitoba's history almost from the instant it became a part of Canada. It really was a reign of terror against the Métis of the Red River. So now, folks, we're going to go into our third Metis Trailblazer. I'm still trying to sort of digest the really tragic ending of Elzear Goulet. And our third Metis Trailblazer is Ambroise Lepine. He was born March 18th, 1840 in St. Boniface, Manitoba, and he was a Métis politician, farmer, and military leader under the command of Louis Riel during the Red River Resistance of 1869 to 1870. He was the fifth of six children of Jean-Baptiste Baron de Lepine, who was an engaged of the Hudson Bay Company, and his mother, Julie Henry. He was educated at the College du Saint Boniface, and Lepine married Cecile Marion in Saint Boniface on January 12th, 1859. He became a farmer there on River Lot 119, and their union produced 14 children. Lepine supplemented his income with freighting and hunting. There appears to be no evidence that Lepine was politically active prior to 1869. And on his return to the Red River settlement on October 30th from a freighting expedition to Fort Pitt, Saskatchewan, he learned that the Métis, led by Louis Riel, had taken steps to delay the transfer of Rupert's Land from the Hudson Bay Company to Canada and forced the Canadian government to negotiate the terms of union with the colony's inhabitants. Apparently, asked by Riel if he was for or against the Métis, Lepine replied he was in favor of Métis rights. And Riel ordered Lepine with 14 others to ride to Pembina, North Dakota, to turn back the lieutenant governor designate William McDougall at the border. And on December 7th, on Louis Riel's orders, Lepine led 100 Métis in the capture of Canadians who were garrisoned in the house of one of their leaders, John Schultz. And on January 8th, 1870, Riel's provisional government appointed Lepine adjutant general to administer justice in the settlement. A few weeks later, Lepine was also elected to represent St. Boniface in a convention of 40 representatives of the settlement, and he was subsequently appointed head of the Military Council, a subcommittee of the convention. It has been speculated that Riel chose Lepine as his military chief because of the respect he commanded among the Métis tripmen and buffalo hunters. Reverend Roderick George Macbeth described Lepine as a man of prodigious strength, standing fully 6'3" and built in a splendid proportion, reputedly a skilled plainsman. So there you go. Very, very important. That description of him there, very important. And in March 1870, diarist Alexandra Begg noted that there was open revolt amongst the Métis over Lepine's conduct. So there seemed to be a dispute over Lepine's conduct, and Riel patched up the affair but ordered him not to be so overbearing. A more convincing explanation for Lepine's advancement in the Riel party involves his loyalty to Riel and their close personal and family ties. February 1870, Lepine and a group of Métis arrested Major Bolton and a number of men after their plan to capture Fort Garry was made known. Among the prisoners, of course, was Thomas Scott, whose behavior soon angered his Métis guards. Riel ordered Scott court-martialed, and as the military leader, March 3rd, Lepine headed to the tribunal that tried Scott and found him guilty of rebelling, treason against the government, and it was he who declared that Scott should be executed. It was Riel, however, who turned down all pleas to really spare Scott's life. And Scott's execution would have very profound repercussions for both Riel and Lepine. And arrival of troops, of course, led by Wolseley on August 24th, 1870, along with the warnings that their lives were in extreme danger, this really persuaded Riel and Lepine to flee. They eventually ended up at the Catholic mission of St. Joseph in North Dakota. October 1871, Lepine was chosen captain of the troops from the St. Boniface, who volunteered to defend the settlement against the Fenian invasion led by William O'Donnell. He hoped that these very loyal actions would really result in his amnesty, but it was not forthcoming. Lepine was unhappy in the United States. By May 1873, he resolved to go home. Back in Manitoba, Lepine returned to his farm. His arrest on September 17th on the charge of murdering Scott was the initiative, really, of two Canadians who had been imprisoned by the Métis, and it caused a great stir in Manitoba. June 1874, Lepine was released on $8,000 bail, and the trial began on October 13th, and it lasted until November 4th, when the jury, 6 French, 6 English-speaking members, returned a verdict of guilty with the recommendation of mercy. Governor General Lord Dufferin eventually decided that Lepine's sentence should be commuted to 2 years in prison, along with the forfeiture of his civil rights. A few months later, April 1875, both Riel and Lepine were offered an amnesty on the condition they accept a 5-year banishment from Canada. So, unlike Riel, Lepine refused this offer, choosing to serve out the balance of his sentence. After his release from prison on October 26, 1876, Lepine maintained close contact with Riel and Taché and remained active in Manitoba's French-speaking community. In 1871, he had participated in the formation of the Union Saint Alexandre to protect Métis interests in the new province, and so that's very important. And in 1878, he was elected vice president of the Society Saint Jean Baptiste. The following year, when Riel tried to enlist him in the project of uniting the Métis and Indians of the Northwest in a confederacy, he traveled to Montana Territory to meet with Riel. Lepine took the advice of Taché, who was worried about possible trouble in the Northwest, and left before seeing Riel. This decision and his siding with Taché over Riel seemed to have, it was really a turning point, and from then on, Lepine stayed out of Métis politics. And the Lepine family remained in St. Boniface until 1882, where they moved to Grand Point. After a fire destroyed their farm in 1891, they settled amongst relatives and friends at Oak Lake. By 1902, he was homesteading near Forget, Saskatchewan, close to his sons. And 1908, his wife Cecile died, and he moved in with his children. In 1909, the Winnipeg Evening Telegram reported that Lepine was in Winnipeg and was willing to disclose the location of Thomas Scott's body for money. Lepine at this time also maintained that Roman Catholic priest Jean-Marie Joseph Lestin and Noel Joseph Richaud had advised Riel to execute Scott. That's a real turn of events for Lepine to say that two Roman Catholic priests had advised Riel to execute Scott. The church, of course, was quick to reject those allegations and silence Lepine, who had then denied that he had ever offered to reveal the location of Scott's body. Shortly before his death, Lepine had his civil rights restored and moved back to St. Boniface. He died at the Hospital de St. Boniface in 1923. He is buried in the St. Boniface Cemetery next to Riel. And not a national politician or a strategic, Lepine was a loyal follower of Riel and the church. When the interests of Riel and the church began to really diverge in 1879, he sided with Taché and the church. And of course, this brings to the end those key points of Ambroise Lepine, another trailblazer, and you'll see the collations as well as these amazing people. Now, folks, we're going to get to our number 4 Metis Trailblazers, and it's John Norquay. And John Norquay was born May 8th, 1841, near St. Andrews, Manitoba. He was the second son of John Norquay and Isabella Toothwaite. As an able student, he really soon became the protege of Church of England Bishop of Rupert's Land, David Anderson, who provided him with odd jobs. After graduation from St. John's Collegiate School about 1857, Norquay taught in the settlement, and in 1858, at age 17, he was master of St. James Church School. Mid-1860s, Norquay and his wife Elizabeth, her maiden name Setter, went to High Bluff near Portage la Prairie, where he engaged in farming. Norquay only played a minor role in the events of Riel's Red River Resistance 1869-1870, but decided to enter public life shortly thereafter. Citizens of the new High Bluff constituency meeting on December 27, 1870, elected Norquay by acclamation to serve in Manitoba's first legislative assembly. Norquay had assumed leadership of one fraction of the English-speaking mixed blood, or country-born as we call them, in the unstable political situation which followed the Manitoba Act of 1870. A giant man, over 6 feet tall and weighing over 300 pounds. In addition to his political career, Norquay was also a prominent member of the Church of England in Manitoba. Beginning in 1875, he was regularly elected as a representative to the Synod of the Diocese of Rupertsland. Norquay, of course, was a victim of some very nasty racial slurs, and legislative councillor Donald Gunn once referred to John Norquay as Greasy John. Norquay spoke a number of languages, including English, French, Cree, Soto, and possibly, and it's safe to assume, folks, Bungi, the Red River dialect. John Norquay successfully moved from the fur trade, there you see the fur trade line again, and the river lot into modern business and politics. And after Manitoba entered Confederation at that time, so politics, including the troubles of the 1869-1870, really didn't affect the family directly, although Norquay attended several of the public meetings concerned with Louis Riel's provisional government and the transfer of the Northwest from the Hudson Bay Company to Canada. From about 1874 to the early 1800s, Norquay and his family were to live on a small farm north of Winnipeg in the St. Andrews district, where English-speaking half-breeds, or country-born as we call them, were numerous. He became a member of the Board of Education of Manitoba, a justice of the peace, and even a supervisor of a smallpox quarantine. And Norquay administered a department which constructed and maintained roads, bridges, and public buildings. He was respected as an orator and a representative of the old order of Red River. By 1878, Norquay's ascendancy into the assembly was unquestioned, and his moderate stance on public issues had made him a representative of not just the half-breeds, but all of Manitoba. And Norquay's appointment to succeed Davis as premier in November 1878 was both predictable and popular at the time. Norquay's political career spanned a period which saw dramatic changes in the province of Manitoba. The population of Manitoba, which grew from roughly around 12,000 to about 30,000 between 1870 and 1877, doubled in the next 4 years and doubled again by the time Norquay left office in 1887. This issue around which all of Norquay's political problems seems to really stem and gather with what was the railways at that time. His personal finances received really a bad setback. However, when the Saskatchewan Coal Mining and Transportation Company, of which he was president, ran into financial difficulties in 1886, and despite his frantic maneuvering, he still was left with a $1,500 personal debt to his own government. The railroad problem brought about Norquay's humiliation in 1887. Just as Norquay had been kept in power by the Prime Minister, so he was removed from office by him. And rumors of financial scandal floated about Winnipeg for some weeks, and then were made public by a former Norquay supporter, Edward Philip Leacock. At this point, the pressure upon Norquay and his cabinet colleagues was extremely intense. During these hectic months, Norquay alternated between euphoria and bitter depression. Norquay's government fell as his cabinet colleagues deserted on December 23rd, 1887. Norquay did not despair as a result of this defeat. He continued to assert his innocence of any financial wrongdoing. During the 18 months between his defeat and his death, they schemed to find a government appointment that would get Norquay out of politics. MacDonald was adamant about not giving a public service job to an enemy, so Norquay was forced to take a position as a law clerk. In early 1889, he was selling insurance to supplement his income as a member of legislature. Early July 5th, 1889, Norquay was struck by a very sudden ailment, perhaps appendicitis, and because of the heat, maybe because of the heat, the severity of the attack, he died. He is buried in St. John's Cathedral Cemetery in Winnipeg. So let's sort of recap all of the accomplishments of John Norquay. Of course, he was the first Métis Premier from October 16th, 1878 to December 24th, 1887. He was a member of the Legislative Assembly for High Bluff from December 27th, 1870 to December 23rd, 1874. He was a member of the Legislative Assembly for St. Andrews South, December 23rd, 1874 to December 16th, 1879. Member of Legislative Assembly for Kildonan, July 11th, 1888 to July 5th, 1889. John Norquay was one of the most dominant figures in Manitoba in an era that was marked by rapid population growth, extraordinary social change, and seemingly constant negotiations with the federal government over the terms and even the nature of Confederation. John Norquay left really a great legacy. He successfully led Manitoba as it transitioned from the fur trade. So as Manitoba made that transition from the fur trade era to the very cups of modern age, the modern era. So very important legacy of John Norquay. Of course, he was also Minister of Public Works, Minister of Agriculture, 1871 to 1874. He was Provincial Secretary, 1875 to 1876, 1886 to 1887, Minister of Public Works, 1875 to 1878, Provincial Treasurer, 1878 to 1886, President of the Council, 1879, 1887, Railway Commissioner, 1886 to 1887. Man, oh man, this is a Métis individual. Not only is he the first Métis Manitoba Premier, but he's got all these accomplishments, even though he was really targeted for financial misdeeds. And really, John MacDonald said that he didn't want him back in any political light. But this was an amazing Métis trailblazer. And if that wasn't even enough, folks, in 1904, Mount Norquay in Banff National Park was named after Norquay. As it is said, Norquay attempted to climb the mountain in 1887 or 1888, but contrary to some reports, did not reach the summit. Poor health and route difficulties presented by the mountain were likely the reason for John Norquay not reaching the top. And rightly so, Norquay is commemorated with several locations in Winnipeg, Manitoba: Norquay Street, Norquay School, and Norquay Park. So what an absolute amazing Métis trailblazer in the political realm of Manitoba as it enters into the very cups of the modern era. Now, folks, we're going to come to our fifth Métis trailblazer, and we're going to discuss Marie Rose Delorme Smith. And it's important to note, folks, did you know that she finally has been designated as a National Historic Person? And Marie Rose Delorme Smith was designated a National Historic Person in recently 2022. And let's learn more about this fascinating person. She was a Métis homesteader, a rancher, community builder, and an author from southern Alberta. She is also known as a Métis medicine woman, a Métis herbalist. She really exemplified the leadership of a Métis woman. She was the daughter of Urbain Delorme and Marie Desmarais. Marie Rose was born in 1861 in St. Francis Xavier, Manitoba, Red River. Her father died when she was young, leaving her. He left her money to enroll her and her sister in the Grey Nuns boarding school in St. Boniface, Manitoba. And it is really there that from the ages of 12 to 16 years old, she learned to speak and write in French and English, while she always remained fluent in Cree, and it's very likely also in Michif. Marie Rose spoke with sadness at her time in the convent, removed from the annual routine of traversing the western plains with her family to trade and hunt buffalo. Her mother eventually remarried, and after 4 years at the convent, Marie Rose rejoined her mother and stepfather as they continued their yearly route of leaving the Red River to cross the plains, hunting and trading with the First Nation people. It was on one of these trips across the plains in 1877 that Marie Rose's family encountered the robe and whiskey trader Charlie Smith. Recognizing that Charlie appeared to be a trader of some material wealth, her mother negotiated an arrangement which she would receive $50, and Charlie Smith, 17 years older than Marie Rose, would receive a wife. So here you have Marie Rose's mother making an arrangement to receive $50, and Charlie Smith would receive a wife. So that's the $50 wife, folks. Marie Rose and Charlie Smith built a house and barn on the Jug Handle Ranch in southern Alberta, where they lived until Charlie's death in 1914. While Charlie was often away from home for long periods, Marie Rose devoted her life to raising her 17 children, tending to the cattle and horses, and managing a small home run business in which she really produced traditional clothing and items for newcomers. And after Charlie's death, Marie Rose established a boarding house in the town of Pincher Creek and took a second homestead, served as midwife and medicine woman, and took the time to write her memoirs. And while she was not successful in having these memoirs published in their entirety, she did publish a series of articles in the Prairie periodical Canadian Cattleman. She also owned her own property at a time when few Euro-Canadian women or Métis women, even fewer Indigenous women, were able to do so. She is really a rare example of a Métis chronicler of the roles of Métis women during the fur trade, buffalo hunting and homesteading periods, and of the cultural changes of the prairies. In her later years, Marie Rose spent her time with family in Lethbridge and Edmonton. Predeceased by 12 of her children, Marie Rose sadly passed away April 4th, 1960, at the age of 99 in Lethbridge. So let's recap this Metis trailblazer, Marie Rose Delorme Smith. She was a Metis rancher, homesteader, medicine woman, midwife, and author who was noted for her work chronicling the daily life of Métis women. Her original log cabin from the Jug Handle Ranch is found at the Kootenai Brown Pioneer Village in Pincher Creek, Alberta. And archives of her writing can be found in the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, and Canadian Cattlemen also republished two of her articles in 2014 as part of their history section. She, in prior to her death, had spent countless hours making buckskin articles, some beaded and some not. She made gauntlets, gloves, vests, shirts, and moccasins, and people came from the surrounding towns and ranches to buy her goods. The Hudson Bay Company even gave her many orders to fill. The Canadian Pacific Railroad also contracted Marie Rose to sew camp tents used during the 1897-1898 construction of its Crow's Nest line, and she sold and traded her goods for supplies to fill her larder for the growing family, and thus she earned the name also of Buckskin Mary. She penned a 10-part serialized autobiography and local history entitled 80 Years on the Plains, and also a biography of Marie Rose Smith entitled The $50 Bride, was written by her granddaughter, Jock Carpenter. So, you know what? What a very extensive list in part two of Metis Trailblazers. It just gets better and better. And again, I hope you're enjoying this new series, Metis Trailblazers. We're on part two already, and I'm going to be working on part three. I thank each and every one of you for the tremendous support on this joining me on this journey as we explore, we share, we celebrate Métis people who again have set the stage, have set the firm foundations for a strong and proud Métis nation. As always, take care, and until next time, thank you.